Hello there. Happy Friday. I'm always so glad to make it to Friday. I don't know about you. My name is Julie Hirschberg. I'm the owner of Reactive Physical Therapy and Wellness in Los Angeles, and joining you every Friday to chat about the things that we're doing and learning at Reactive. To really help people with neurologic disorders and the therapists and the people that work with them to help them more. So, thanks for joining me this Friday. I have been getting a lot of questions from other therapists about 3PD. And that's because we did a course on it and we've been talking about it in our Brain Bites community, which is our educational and mentoring group. And so I've been getting questions and just wanted to come in here and answer them. So we're just going to dive right in. So, some of the big questions that we get is somebody had said, one of my biggest challenge is the initial education with the person, how to deliver that thoughtfully yet thoroughly. So, we're going to chat about that first. The second is what to do when stuck with the progression of activities and the home program. Great question. Third is how to sort out the differential diagnosis through the exam. Always a really, really important piece, probably one of my favorites. I love differential diagnosis, so we'll talk about that. And then fourth, how to explain what is happening, especially if a specific diagnosis hasn't been given. And that is very, very common. So let's hit on all of those, and let's start with that initial education to deliver it thoroughly, yeah, and thoughtfully. So I think the initial education, that initial session with a person is so important. And it's really easy when they've already been given the diagnosis and they've started researching it. There's a lot less that we might be doing from an education standpoint. Um, but many people have not, or they've researched and there's not a lot out there on it. So this is really where we came in. And we actually created a workbook to work through these educational pieces. This was included in part of our course. It's included in our Brain Bites. And we also sell our diagnostic specific workbooks as part of a fundraiser for our pro bono services. So I forgot about that. So I'll put a link in case you're interested in the workbooks. But they're a really lovely way to set up the education, but you don't need a workbook to do this. I think the most important thing is to start with asking the person what they know and what they understand might be contributing to the symptoms. So we often use this pie chart idea. We have a person make their own pie chart. What do they see is contributing to their symptoms from a neurologic perspective, from their tissues like strength, flexibility, things like that, their environment, and their life. So we start there. Start by asking, what do you think is contributing to the symptoms? And I find when I start with more questions than answers, it's really beneficial for both of us. So then I can start my education where they are at. So let's give an example. Very common 3PD is triggered by an initial vestibular event, right? So a person may come in and say, well, I really think a lot of this is my vestibular system. I have this neurologic onset. I had a vestibular neuritis, right? And I had that about 6 months ago and it just didn't quite resolve. So that is so helpful. And what a great insight and understanding from the person. And then you start there. You're right. You had this. And in our exam, we're going to actually see how much that has resolved or not. And we know that with 3PD, people start with this initial event, and most people go into recovery, but about 30% of people hang out with more symptoms. And we actually have a little diagram that walks through why somebody might actually hang out with more symptoms. And then again, I ask the person, why do you think you are still having the symptoms? And, maybe they start to explain, well, you know what? When this happened, it was a really stressful time. It's been the pandemic. I got really anxious. And so they're self-identifying some of those neuroplastic contributors to their symptoms. So the answer then to this common question of kind of that initial education with the person with Re+PD is to start by asking questions. Ask about their understanding, and then let that direct your education. Okay, the second is what to do when stuck with the progression of activities and the home program. I love this question so much because I do think that we as therapists experience this a lot. I hear this a lot of just like, I got stuck. I feel stuck here in this progression. So some of the guidelines for all things, but especially with Re+PD, is coming back to their goal. So here at Re+active, when we start with somebody, we actually write up a mutual collaborative goal document where they're identifying their goals, we're fleshing those out with them, and usually 3 or 4 goals. We outline those in their own language and send that to them. And we talk about that in every single session. So we call it our first session goals sheet, but it literally becomes a part of every session. I've even started taking that wording into my documentation, and I put that in as I'm documenting as well. So, so come back to their goals. Always come back to their goals. And are you making these successive approximations and successful experiences toward the goal? And even if it's the tiniest baby step, which it often is in Re+PD, because we have this real graded exposure of visual motion and body motion, desensitization, it moves very slowly. Is it getting to their specific goal? So yes, we do a lot of head movements or eye movements and visual motion desensitization. It should be getting to a specific goal. So I have a really good example from last night in our Brain Bites. Renee, one of our members, brought in a great case, and the person loved cats. And somebody suggested, well, how about cat videos become the visual motion desensitization? So using something that's very specific to the person and then progressing that. So the goals become the goals, the person's interest, what they love becomes part of that progression. And then progressing the amount of time. So dosing is a really big piece of the vestibular progression. Progressing the amount of information. So for example, visual desensitization going from a small screen to a big screen, and progressing the balance component of it. So from maybe even supine to sitting to standing to narrow base to uneven bases of support. So lots of things that we can progress. And I always want to think too, when I might get stuck, is coming back to the pie chart. So we, in our course, and last night, this is actually one of our slides from Brain Bites last night, we use the pie chart to really classify what areas we're really working on and progressing, and seeing when we have that home program. And I use this for the people I'm working with too. I say, we're working on autonomic pieces here. We're working on the sensory balance, and we're working on these, and here are our progressions. And typically, because I see people where it's spaced out a few weeks between sessions, I actually give them several progressions. So I say, here's where we're starting today. once you can do this for 5 minutes, then move to this next video. And then once you can do this, then we're going to move here. And then you're going to do it with your feet in tandem and so on. So we're just really lining up those progressions for them based on their success. It gives the person so much autonomy to be able to progress themselves. So it's one of the reasons I'd like to spread out some of those visits and really build up a person's autonomy for it, right? So the other thing when I get stuck then is I go, okay, well, maybe I've worked through a lot of this visual motion piece, and I haven't really addressed the sensory reweighting component. So let me step in and add that component to the program for them. So I'm always coming back to the pie chart. Okay, so that was what, when we get stuck in the progression and the home program. So the third was how to sort out differential diagnosis through the exam. And this one can be really tough, but probably the most important. So I'm going to come back to the pie chart. And this was actually the pie chart from our course last night. And it's the common findings in 3PD. By the way, Janine Holmberg, Jeffrey Staub, I really took a lot of the pieces from their research and the literature to make the pie chart. So, because the first thing we want to do is make sure it fits those diagnostic criteria, that the initial vestibular onset is resolved, or if it's not, maybe you have these layers. Maybe you still have an uncompensated vestibular neuritis and 3PD, right? So the exam becomes so important. We look at the common findings. For example, when we do the vestibular exam in a person with 3PD, there shouldn't be really positive tests, meaning like a positive head impulse test or VOR cancellation is impaired. Those would signal to us that there is still a vestibular component of this. But what we do typically see is a sensitivity to the testing. So the ocular motor exam brings on symptoms of dizziness because there's a oculomotor motion sensitivity, right? So we see a lot of that. So of course, our vestibular exam is hugely important. I would say seems about like half of the people that I work with still have residual deficits. And so we need to address those as well. And Brittany Charlet in our course, by the way, talked about this so nicely because the case that she presented was somebody that still had residual deficits from a vestibular neuritis, and those needed to be resolved and then could be move into more of the treatment for the 3PD. And Pedro asked, could you put a link for the pie chart? I don't have a link for the pie chart just yet. So to be coming for you, I should make this a download. We have our pie chart that we use for other neurologic diagnoses, for functional movement disorders. That's where we kind of first started with the pie chart, but we made a specific one for 3PD because it has specific components. So I should review those with you here too. So autonomic is one component, psychosocial, sensory and balance, visual, oculomotor, motion sensitivity, and then those precipitating factors. So what vestibular event happened, and then perpetuating factors. These are also really common, like neck stiffness and pain. So now the person also has maybe cervicogenic dizziness overlaying this, right? So that's something that we have also found in common. So when we have to work through the differential diagnosis, we need to really look at, does this person meet the criteria? And do they still have that uncompensated or something hasn't quite resolved? So you really do need to look at all components of that pie chart and know your differential diagnosis. So in Brain Bites, for example, we talked a lot about Meniere's disease. In our course, we talked a lot about migraine and how to distinguish these from 3PD. So I know for me, like I'm constantly returning back to my Herdman book and to what I teach at USC to really kind of confirm that I have a good sense of a differential diagnosis. Um, okay, so the fourth and final question was explaining what is happening when there hasn't been that specific diagnosis or a specific cause. And I think this links back to the other pieces very, very well. It is something that's really hard, but I think we come across this a lot, especially if the person hasn't been to an ENT or neurologist that has worked with 3PD before. So first then, kind of back to the third question, differential diagnosis is part of the exam, have some very, very clear findings. And can you show resolution of the initial symptoms? So for example, I have somebody recently where it was BPPV was some of the initial symptoms. So it was positional, it was rolling over in bed, severe vertigo, but then it did not resolve. So 3 months is our time frame for 3PD. And the first thing that we really want to do is to show that that person really doesn't have BPPV still, right? So that would be the first step. And I talk through this a lot with the person, like, wow, it sounds like you have BPPV. Let's check to see if that has reoccurred. And if not, then, and let's rule everything else out. We'll do a very thorough neurologic exam, vestibular exam, and then I can say, you know, it looks like it is lining up well with this, with 3PD. And here's what we know about it, and let's talk to your doctor about it. And of course, we could do the screening and say, you know what, some things are not matching up, and I think you should see your neurologist and do more testing. Or we may do the exam and go, you know what, like all of those things and the headaches and the auras, like this is you have a history of migraine. Okay, like let's get you back to your migraine doctor and let's manage this and then treat the possible overlay of 3PD with that, because absolutely you could have vestibular migraine and 3PD. So what I find when the diagnosis isn't given, which is a common one, and even when it is, I'm always screening, always doing really thorough testing to ensure that indeed what we are working with is what we think. This is something I talk a lot about in my course that I teach for the PT students at USC, is like go in as a skeptic. It doesn't matter what the prescription said, what the person says, like ensure that that is precisely what it is. So a very thorough neuro exam, your vestibular exam are going to be a big part of that. Even medical screening, right? So there's a lot of things medical wise, medication wise that can cause dizziness, and we need to screen that as well. So that gets us to that last question, was really kind of how do I explain what is happening when that specific diagnosis hasn't been made. And so I just go through my whole exam and I explain exactly what I am seeing and what I am doing. And when I do get down to, look, all of these things have tested negative. You don't have BPPV anymore. That was totally negative. But these movements, the body movements, the visual motion, the head movement, the eye movement are all really causing your symptoms. The first thing is that it's very treatable and can be fully recovered. And I do want that person to have the medical diagnosis. And so I will try to connect them with an ENT or neurologist that understands 3PD because I think it's so important. And because part of this three-pronged approach for really high success with recovery can include medications. Now, not everybody gets medication or needs medication, but it should be considered. So working with a neurologist, ENT, to make those recommendations and have the discussion is so important. So having a team, always having a team. So I want to thank you. Thank you for sending these really great questions. I love it. And it really spurs on a lot of what we do here every Friday is you send questions and we try to share answers. So we just love learning. We're so curious about what is happening in the brain, about research and literature in these fields. And so when we read and learn, we'll share it with you. And thanks for coming on that journey with me. I hope you're finding it helpful. And we will see you next Friday. Have a wonderful weekend.